The rope was still in my hand when I went under. I remember that. The way it bit through the leather of my glove, the burn of it, even through the cold. And then the ice gave, and the world turned white and silent, and I was beneath it, looking up at the hole I'd fallen through like it was a door I'd never reach again. I had gone out after the horse. Stupid. The mare had wandered onto the lake in the dark, and I'd heard her break through and the sound of it. A horse screaming in water under ice. It gets into you in a way that doesn't shake loose. So I'd gone after her with a rope and a plank, and the kind of certainty a man has at 47 that he knows what he's doing, that his body still does what he tells it, that the cold can be managed if you're steady. The ice had other thoughts. I'll tell you what drowning is. It's not what they say. There's no peace to it, no floating off. What there is, what I remember, is the weight of your clothes and the absolute zero of the water, and the way your hands stop working before anything else just go useless as boards, and the rope slipped out of them, and I watched it go up through the hole, and the hole was getting smaller, or I was getting farther. I couldn't say which, and I thought, this is the stupidest way. After everything, after the war and the territory and the winter of '71, when half the outfit froze on a ridge in Colorado. After all that, a horse. Then there were hands. I didn't know her name for 3 days. When I came back to myself, I was in a low structure I'd never seen, buffalo hide walls and the smell of wood smoke and something else, cedar, maybe, or sage, and there was heat, actual heat, which I hadn't felt since September. My clothes were gone. I was wrapped in hides, the weight of them like being held down, and outside I could hear wind and the occasional thump of something heavy against the walls, and nothing else. No voices. No horse. I tried to sit up. The world tilted hard. I put my face down into the hide beneath me and lay very still until the tilting slowed. The flap opened. She came in low, the way you have to, in a structure like that, and straightened and looked at me without surprise, like she'd expected to find me trying to sit up and failing and had already decided what she thought of it. She was not young. My age, maybe, close to it. There was gray coming in at her temples, and her face had lines at the corners of her eyes, from years of squinting into the same kind, of wind I'd squinted into, and she was carrying a clay pot and a folded piece of hide. And she crossed to me without a word and set the pot down, and pressed the back of her hand to my forehead the way a woman checks a fever, firm and efficient, no sentiment in it. She said something in Lakota. I don't speak Lakota, I said. Don't. And she held up one hand and shook her head slightly, meaning, don't waste the air. Then, she propped me up against the wall with a matter-of-factness that told me she'd done it before, that my helplessness was not a problem to her, but a fact to be managed. And she put the pot in my hands and waited until she was satisfied my grip would hold before she let go. Broth. Hot. Some kind of meat and something else I couldn't place, slightly bitter, and I drank it all. Because I was empty, in a way I hadn't felt since I was 19 and half dead on a different kind of ground. She watched me drink it. Not hovering, just watching, the way you watch a fire to make sure it catches. When I handed the pot back, she took it and looked at me and said something else in Lakota. I shook my head. She tried again. A different word, slower. I still didn't have it. Then she put her hand flat against her own chest and said, clearly in English, Wachiwi. I'd come to the Powder River country 6 months before, which I realize now sounds like the beginning of a different kind of story. It wasn't. There was no romance in it. No fresh start. No sense that a man could shake something off in a new territory and come out clean on the other side. I came because Thomas Lyle, who had been my partner in a freighting operation out of Laramie for 11 years, had died in August of a kicked mule and a wound that went bad in the heat. And when the accounts were settled, I found that I'd been a fool about certain things. Not cheated. Thomas wasn't that kind of man. But I hadn't been paying close enough attention, and the operation was thinner than I'd believed. And by the time the debts were cleared, there was enough to buy a small piece of land on the Powder River with a cabin already on it. And enough supplies to get through one winter if I was careful, and didn't lose a horse to a frozen lake. I'd met Thomas's wife once. Nice woman. She cried at the funeral, in the specific way people cry, when they've been crying for weeks already, and have run out of tears to spare. I gave her what I could. It wasn't enough. I'd had a wife once too. Eleanor, 18 years ago. She died of a fever the second winter we were in the territory, before we'd made anything of it. Before the land had begun to feel like it belonged to us, rather than the other way around. I'd buried her in ground that was still half frozen, and ridden east for a year, doing nothing in particular. And when I came back west, I came back without the specific weight that a man carries when there's someone to come home to. I'd learned, in the years since, how to be a man alone, how to fill the quiet, how to not mind it. Or I'd learned how to believe I didn't mind it, which amounts to roughly the same thing. The Powder River country was the edge of what I knew. North of there was Lakota territory, Sioux, in the newspapers. But that wasn't what they called themselves, and the army was still in it, and the whole situation had the particular tension of a pull between high point two that both intended to hold. I knew enough to stay south. I knew enough to keep my head down and my mouth shut and to not go looking for trouble. I had not, apparently, known enough to stay off a frozen lake in November. She had pulled me out herself. I learned this gradually, over the days that followed, in the way you learn things from a woman who speaks a different language. Not through words but through demonstration, through the particular economy of her gestures. She'd been on the far bank with two younger men, her nephews as I later understood, and they'd seen me go through, and she'd had a rope on the nearest horse and she'd thrown it to the spot where the hole was, and she'd held it while one of the nephews went out on the ice with a plank and used it to hook the trailing end of my rope and pull me close enough to grab. And then the three of them had hauled me up the bank. And she'd made the decision, right there in the dark and the cold, bring me to the camp rather than leave me to die on the shore. I don't know how many times I've thought about that decision. Not the heroism of it, though it was heroic, though the ice had to be uncertain and the risk was real. What I've thought about is the decision itself, that she looked at me in the dark. A white man she didn't know, unconscious, half frozen, probably going to die anyway. And she decided he was worth saving. That she decided without sentiment, without delay, that she spent the warmth of her camp and the medicine of her stores and 3 days of her own time on a man who might wake up and be the wrong kind. I was the right kind. I want to believe I would have been the right kind, even if it assassinated me, that it was already in me. But I'll tell you honestly, a man who's been pulled out of a frozen lake by a woman who owes him nothing, he becomes careful about what kind he is. After that, something shifts. The balance of things shifts. On the fourth day I could stand. She'd had the nephews bring my gear from the cabin, my saddlebags, the spare rifle, the box of shells, my winter coat which was still damp. And it was piled in the corner of her lodge, and I went through it in the morning while she was outside doing something with the horses, and everything was there. Not a thing touched. The small amount of scrip I had in the inner pocket of the bags, the watch that had been my father's, the folded daguerreotype of Eleanor, that I'd carried since the territory. All there. I held the daguerreotype for a moment. Eleanor was 26 in it, which was all she'd ever be, and she was looking at the camera, with the expression she always had in photographs. Not quite smiling, she thought. Smiling, for a photograph, was slightly foolish, but didn't want to be rude about it. I put it back. Wachiwi came back in and saw me standing and said nothing, but the set of her jaw changed slightly. She went past me to the fire and fed it, then came back with the broth pot. She'd had me on broth for 3 days, and I shook my head. Solid food, I said, and I mimed chewing like an idiot, and the corner of her mouth moved, not a smile, something restrained. She went out again, came back with dried meat and something ground and pressed into cakes. I ate it all. It tasted like nothing I'd had before, and I didn't ask what it was, and I didn't care. That afternoon, one of the nephews, the older one, maybe 25, with his aunt's same directness in the way he looked at you, came in and sat down and said, in slow and careful English, "She says you will need to stay 3 more days. The cold is bad." "I understand," I said. "Tell her I'm grateful," he translated. She listened without looking at me, then said something back. He said, "She says you should not be grateful. She says you were foolish to go on the ice." "She's right," I said. "Tell her she's right," he translated again. This time she did look at me. Just for a moment, quick in assessing. The way you look at a thing you're trying to decide if it's what it appears to be. Whatever she decided, I didn't know. She went back to what she was doing. His name was Tsunke, the nephew, and his English was the careful English of a man who'd learned it at a school he hadn't chosen and used it deliberately, selecting words. The younger nephew didn't speak it at all. Over the following days, Tsunke and I talked in the mornings, while Wachiwi was out, and I learned, piece by piece, what the camp was. She was the wife of a chief who died the previous winter. No children of her own. Her husband's band was small now. Most of them had gone south to the agency the spring before, following Red Cloud. And what remained was this: Tsunke and his brother Chaitan, 2 older women who lived in a second lodge, and a family of 4 and a third. 11 people. They'd wintered in this valley for years, tucked against a bluff that broke the north wind, and they intended to winter here again, whether the army had opinions about it or not. She ran it. That was clear. Not. There was no announcement in her, no performance of authority. But in the way the camp organized around her, priest decisions got made or didn't. When Tsunke asked her something and she answered, it was answered. When she looked at a piece of work and then at the person doing it, they did it differently. I'd known men who had that quality. Not many. It wasn't about loudness or size. It was about being deeply sure, at the bone level, of what mattered and what didn't, and acting only on the things that mattered. It made everything she did very clean, very clear. I watched her a great deal in those days. I wasn't proud of it. It felt like taking something I hadn't been offered. But she was the thing in the room, the thing in the camp, the thing you looked at when you didn't mean to. On the 5th morning, she spoke to me directly. Not through Tsunke. He wasn't there. She came back from the horses and crouched by the fire and looked across it at me and said something in Lakota that was clearly a question. I said, "I don't," and then stopped because I'd said that already and it hadn't helped. She tried again, more slowly. A single word I couldn't place. Then she looked at the fire, then at me, then put her hand flat against her chest, the way she had on the first day. Then she pointed at me and raised her chin slightly, which I took for a question. I put my hand against my own chest. "Caleb," I said. "Caleb Marsh." She said it back, quietly, trying the sound of it. Got close. Tried again. 3rd time it was mine. Then she said something else and went out. And that was the morning's conversation. And I sat with the fire, and the smell of cedar, and my own name in her mouth, and tried to think about something practical. On the 7th day, I got on my horse. She was watching from the entrance of the lodge when I did it. Watching to see if I could, I think, rather than watching to say goodbye. I could. My ribs still ached on the left side, where I'd hit something on the way out of the water, and I moved carefully. But I got up without making a fool of myself. I'd already done what I could for the camp before leaving. Split 2 weeks of wood. Checked the other horse's shoes, and found one loose, and fixed it with the tools in my bags. Patched a section of one lodge's outer cover, where the wind was getting in. I couldn't talk to most of them, but I'd found, over the week, that work was its own language. That offering your hands to a problem is a thing that needs no translating, and the older women had let me work without ceremony, handing me things when I needed them, correcting my mistakes without embarrassment. Wachiwi had watched that too. Now, I reined the horse around and looked down at her and tried to find what to say. I had rehearsed something through Tasunki, but he wasn't here, and whatever I'd rehearsed had come apart. What I said was, "I'll come back." I don't know where it came from. I hadn't decided it consciously. It was just the thing that was true, and it came out without ceremony. She looked up at me. She had that look again, assessing, without judgment, just honest. She said something I didn't have, then glanced toward the south where my land was. Then back at me I said, "Yes, south. I'll come back before the hard winter." She said something short, not warm, not cold, something final, like a nail driven clean. I rode south. I came back in 12 days. I'd meant to come in 3 or 4. I wanted to come sooner than that, which was its own kind of information I was slow to deal with. But the cabin needed work before the hard cold came, and I found damage to the roof I hadn't known about, and fixing it properly took time. Then the mare, the one I'd tried to save, who'd gotten herself out before I went in, perfectly fine and had no idea she'd nearly killed me. Threw a shoe in the mud, and I lost a day to that. 12 days. I rode north in weather that had got colder, and arrived at the valley in the early evening, with a pack horse I'd loaded in bitterroot, with what I'd bought there, and with things from the cabin. A sack of flour, side bacon, dried beans and corn, tobacco, 2 bolts of wool trade cloth, a jar of lamp oil, a good skinning knife. I wasn't sure what was needed. I bought what seemed useful. The storekeeper in Bitterroot had given me a look over the counter, deciding something, but he'd sold me the goods without comment. Tasunke met me at the edge of camp. His expression was careful. He said, "You came back. I said I would." He looked at the pack horse, looked at me, then he said, "She said you would." The others said no. I didn't say anything to that. I got down and unloaded the pack horse, and let him take inventory while Isa stood back. And then he carried it all into the camp, and I waited. She came out of the lodge and stopped. She looked at the goods and then at me. There was a long silence, not uncomfortable, the kind of silence where something is being measured. Then she said something to Tasunka, and he translated, "She says you are consistent. Tell her I try to be." He did. She listened and then said something else and went back inside. Tasunka said, "She says you can stay if you work." I stayed. The winter was hard, not killing hard, not the kind that takes people, but the kind that requires constant management. The fire, the horses, the food stores, the ice that formed over the creek every night and had to be broken each morning so the animals could drink. I understood that kind of winter. I'd spent years in it. I came to the camp every week or 10 days, and stayed 2 or 3 days each time, and I worked while I was there. And gradually the work expanded. Not because I pushed for it, but because when a man shows up reliably and works without complaint and doesn't cause trouble, he gets given more work. That's how it goes. It's not a bad thing. I learned words. Not many and slowly, but I learned the ones that came up most often in the work. The names for things, for actions, for simple exchange. She was patient with it, in the same way she was patient with everything. Not warm, exactly, but not cold either. Attentive. She corrected me without a condescension, the way a good teacher does. And when I got a word right, she didn't make a production of it, just moved on. Tasunke translated when it mattered. But there were long stretches, afternoons of work, mornings at the fire, when no one translated anything, and we managed anyway. You can have a real conversation in the wordless kind if both parties are paying attention. The trick is just to pay attention. One night in December, there was a bad storm, the kind where you don't move far from the fire. Tasunki was out checking the horses, and she and I sat on opposite sides of the fire. And she took out a piece of work, something she was stitching, and I cleaned and oiled the rifle I'd left at the camp. And we sat like that for a long time in the wind and the heat and didn't speak, and it was the least lonely I'd felt since Eleanor. I thought about Eleanor less, those months. Not forgotten, I want to be clear about that, but less present. The weight of her had been a specific kind of company for a long time. A weight I'd grown so used to, I'd stopped noticing it, and that winter I began to notice it was lighter, which was disorienting in the way that relief sometimes is when you've been braced against something for so long that its going leaves you uncertain of your balance. I did not confuse what I felt for Wachiwi with the thing I'd felt for Eleanor. They were different women and different things, and I was a different man, and 20 years had happened in between. But I will tell you what I felt like a man who'd been of use, who was valued for what he could do and what he was, who was seen clearly, not romanticized, not pitied, not managed, and found acceptable. Maybe more than acceptable, you can tell, with some people. There's a way a woman's attention changes when you've become something to her, something she's decided is worth holding. I'd seen it once before, long ago, in Eleanor. I was slow to believe I was seeing it again. It was February when she told me about her husband, Tunt, not volunteered. It came out of something else, something Tasunke had said in translation that I'd misunderstood, and in clarifying, Shai found herself saying more than she'd meant to, and I could tell she'd meant to say more for a while. His name was Kangi. She said it once, clearly, and the weight she put on it was small and complete. He'd been sick for 3 winters, the last one bad, and she kept the camp and the band and the decisions together while he died. Which is a particular kind of alone that I understood in the way you understand something you've also done. She said, Tasunka translating carefully, going slower than usual, choosing that the hardest part had not been the dying but what came after. The band going south, the small camp, cease, the sense that the shape of a life she'd known was going, and a different shape was coming, but had not yet arrived, and in between was just the going, just the empty place. I said yes. She looked at me. I said, I know that place. I looked at the fire. My wife died, 20 years ago. Different kind of dying, different country. But that place, the in-between, yes. Tasunk translated quietly. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. Then she said something short. He said, she says you came through it. Most of it, he translated. She said something else. He said, she says you still carry some. I looked at her then. She was looking at me, direct and clear, and there was something in it, not pity. She didn't have pity in her, not that I'd seen. Something else. Recognition, maybe. Shh. The way 2 people who've carried the same kind of weight for a long time look at each other and understand exactly what's in the other's arms, without needing it listed. Yes, I said. Some. We didn't talk about it further that night, but something had changed, and we both knew it had changed, and neither of us said anything about that either. March came in wet. The snow began to go off in the south, but up in the valley it still held, and the creek came up, and the low ground near the bluff went soft and unreliable. I was at my cabin for a 10-day stretch. The mud made the ride impractical, and I did a lot of thinking in that stretch. The kind of thinking a man does when he's alone with a decision he's been avoiding. I'd been avoiding it because I wasn't sure I had the right to make it. Which sounds humble, but is actually just another kind of fear. The right question is never whether you have the right. The right question is whether it's true. And what was true, in March of that year, in a cabin on the Powder River, was that I did not want to go back to being a man alone. That I had been shown, over the winter, what it felt like to be useful and seen and to work alongside someone whose judgment I respected and whose quiet I did not want to leave. And I did not want to leave it. I also knew what I was. Not young, not rich, not easy. A man with a small piece of land and no clear future and a first language she didn't speak. A man who'd been alone long enough that his habits had calcified in ways he couldn't fully see. I had nothing obvious to offer. I had work and steadiness and whatever honesty I was capable of. I had the fact that I had come back when I said I would. I rode north in the 2nd week of March. Tasunki was outside when I arrived, and his face told me something before I got off the horse. Not bad news. Something else, he said. She has been waiting. Has she? I said. 4 days now, she said you would come. He paused. The others said you would not come back for the winter. And she said? He allowed himself a small smile. She said you would come. I got down. Shh. I unsaddled and rubbed the horse down and brought it into the rope line with the others. And I took my time with it, because I was working out what I was going to say and I wanted to say it right. When I came to the lodge, she was inside, by the fire, with the stitching work. And she looked up when I came in and she looked at me in that way she had. Correct, honest measuring. And whatever she was measuring she seemed to find. I sat down across the fire from her. I said, in the Lakota I had, badly, I want to stay. Then in English, because I didn't have the words, I mean something more than a visit. I mean, if you'll have me, near you, looking for the camp. Whatever shape that takes. She held the stitching in her hands and looked at the fire for a long moment. I waited. She was not a woman you rushed. Then she looked at me and said, in English, careful English, deliberate, each word placed. I know what you mean. She'd had more English than she'd showed me. I realized that in the moment she said it. I didn't know how much, enough apparently, to have understood me all winter, or most of it. I didn't feel deceived. I understood the caution. I would have been cautious too. I said, all right, she said in the same careful English. You are a useful man. I try to be. You came back. I said I would. She looked at the stitching in her hands, then back at me. Kanji, she said. He would have liked you. I didn't know what to do with that. Sat with it. I said, that means something. She nodded once, put the stitching down, her hands flat on her knees and looked at me the way she looked at the fire sometimes. Steady, certain, like a thing she'd decided and had no more doubts about. Stay, she said. I want to be honest about what came after, because the honest thing is also the true thing, and the true thing is what matters. It was not easy. People. With 2 lives and 2 languages and 2 line grip habit and the particular stubbornness that comes from years of doing everything alone. Easy is not the word. There were mornings of frustration in both directions. Words that came out wrong and had to be walked back. Silences that were hard rather than comfortable. Differences in how we each thought a thing should be done that required real negotiation and real willingness to be wrong. I was wrong often. She was wrong sometimes and hated it less than I expected, which told me something about her. We built a structure together. Not a lodge, not a cabin, but something between, a thing we arrived at practically, using what the land provided and what I knew and what she knew, and it was unusual and a little strange, and it worked. The camp accepted it. Tasunki had been for it from the start. I learned much later that he'd told her, months before March, that he thought the man who came back was a good man, and that she'd told him she already knew that. The older were careful for a while, and then they weren't. Chayton, the younger nephew, took longer, and I didn't push, and eventually, he came around in the way young men come around when they've decided something is real. There was a night in April, the last of the cold, that sharp spring cold that comes in at night after warm days, where we were sitting outside. The camp had gone in, the 2 of us at the small fire Tasunka had left banked, and she was talking in Lakota about something I could falto mostly and sometimes not. And I was listening and watching the fire in the valley going dark, and she stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked at me and said, in English, you are still here. I am, I said. She put her hand on my arm, not dramatic, just placed it there, the way you place a hand on something solid. The way you say, without saying, this is real, this is here, this is what I've decided. My hand over hers. We sat like that until the fire went low, and neither of us said anything else. And the valley was cold and quiet, and the stars were very clear, and I was aware, in the particular way, a man becomes aware of things that have cost him greatly. That I was not alone in it anymore. That a good woman had seen something in me worth holding, and had held it. And that she was beside me in the cold with her hand and under mine, and that this was what I had. I had not thought I'd have this again. I was wrong. I was wrong about that, and about what was possible at 47, and about the in-between places. About whether they have another side. They do. The rope was still in my hand when I went under. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the cold, not the ice, not even her hands finding me in the dark, just that I'd held on. That even in the black water with my hands going useless, some part of me had held the rope. She pulled me up, she gave me the warmth. I'd been holding on. I think she saw that. I think that's what she saw, that first night, when she looked at me in the dark on the shore and made her decision. That there was a man here who held on. And she was right.